Welcome to episode 3 of Unburden with Bourbon. It's been a long time since I put out episode 2 where we talked about big moments in bourbon history, and we're going to pick up on that in episode 3. But I want to thank you for your patience waiting for this episode. I do have to say, it's been a very exciting summer for us at the Provan household. I had one daughter graduate from high school, and her big gift was going to Disney World. Not only did we get to go to Disney, but we also got to go there with my parents, my sister, a couple of my nephews. Wonderful time there, and yes, I did get to try some bourbon in the new Star Wars Galaxy's Edge part of Disney World. What an absolutely fantastic experience for us. Also had a daughter graduate from 8th grade, so we had some celebrations for her as well. So that's all kept me away from the sound booth, but now I'm here, ready to finish up our series on big moments in bourbon history. We're going to make our way from 1920 to just about present day on this episode. So let's go ahead and do that, starting right now, here on Unburden with Bourbon. Well, again, thank you for joining me on episode 3, where we are going to do part 2 of big moments in bourbon history. Before I do that, I do have to mention one thing that was just really awesome, a great gesture from my parents. While my family and I flew to Orlando and back, my mom and dad drove down there and then drove back up to Milwaukee. And they made a stop in Kentucky, and my dad decided to stop at the Dueling Distillery, a small distillery down in Franklin, Kentucky, and he brought me home a couple of bottles of bourbon. And I have to tell you, I promise you, I'm not getting paid to say this. They were simply fantastic. Very high proof, but very smooth. And while I continue to develop the taste for what's all in these bourbons, what my palate is telling me is in them, I have to say these are some of the best bourbons I've ever had. So if you have an opportunity to get down to Franklin, Kentucky and go to Dueling Grounds Distillery, get yourself a bottle of the small batch that is, it's 100 proof, but my goodness, is it fantastic. Very thick, very smooth. Every bourbon's going to have those vanillas and caramels, but boy, do they really pop in this one. And then the other one that my dad got me that is just amazing, it's their single barrel cask strength. 121 proof. So you got to be careful when you're drinking this stuff, when you're sipping it and enjoying it. But again, very thick. The legs on this just crawl down that glass. When you go to sniff it, oh my goodness, it's a whole new world that opens up. And one of the great things, knowing that you have a good bourbon, is what you're smelling is what you're tasting. I could taste all kinds of nutty flavor in there. You can almost taste the char of the white oak barrel in there as well. Anyways, it's the Dueling Distillery Grounds in Franklin, Kentucky. If you have an opportunity, go there, get some bottles. So, that all said, I want to talk about part 2 in big moments in bourbon history. So in the first part, we talked about the founding of Bourbon County in 1792. Then in 1794, we talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. Then we went to 1818, where we talked about the Louisiana Purchase really opening up a lot of places for bourbon to be sold. In 1823, the sour mash process was developed. And where did we go next after that? Yes, of course, 1897, the Bottled in Bond Act. So that's where we left off. So just a little bit more history here for you. And everybody pretty much knows about this one, but of course this was a massive moment in history. In many ways, a negative moment in history for bourbon, and that of course was Prohibition. The Volstead Act was passed in 1919, but the act wouldn't take effect until a year later in 1920, when, of course, Prohibition, also known as the Volstead Act, went into place. So this went on for 13 years. And really, when this act was first written, When the 18th Amendment, that is, was first written, it was only supposed to be for a 7-year period. And really the point of it then, the thought was that so much grain was being used in alcohol that really needed to be for the World War I war effort. So there was some prohibition already. And the idea was, let's put a ban on grain being used to make alcohol for 7 years so that we can get all of our grain stock filled back up. But eventually, the temperance movement took over, and this was going to be a permanent act. Of course, it gave rise to all the bootleggers, which then gave rise to the mafia, right? So there was this big black market for alcohol. People were making it at home. It became known as bathtub whiskey, and ultimately it also became a very dangerous thing. And the reason really it was so dangerous is that first few percentages of alcohol that comes off the still has a lot of poisonous alcohol in it. In fact, distilleries usually discard that alcohol and get rid of it because of all the dangerous alcohol that is in there. Same thing with the last part of the alcohol that comes out of the still. That can also be very dangerous. So this bathtub whiskey had all of this poisonous alcohol in there, which of course is dangerous for people to consume, but it also made the whiskey taste incredibly bad. And what's interesting to note here is that this is why cocktails became such a prominent thing using mixers, because the alcohol tasted so bad that people started putting soda, they started putting juice, they started putting fruit in their drinks. So while cocktails have always been around, for example, the mojito has been around probably since the 16th century, it was during Prohibition that the idea of mixers really exploded. So if there's one thing we can thank for Prohibition, it's having all these different types of mixed drinks. Two little loopholes, by the way, during Prohibition that were in the Volstead Act is one, you could make your own wine. You could make up to 200 gallons a year. And in fact, that is still legal to do without a permit. Also, doctors could still prescribe alcohol for illnesses. So as you can imagine, a lot of people got sick, I'm doing air quotes right now, during Prohibition. Well, let's make a long story very short. I'm sure most of you know about Al Capone and several other mafia gangs. It really was because of Prohibition that these mafia gangs got to be so big and made so much money because they were bootlegging all this illegal liquor that people were going to get no matter what. So obviously the government didn't like that. But also, when you look at all the home distillery going on, the government couldn't seize enough stills to keep up with all the home distilleries. So it really was a losing effort by the federal government. And then something hit in 1933 that helped expedite getting rid of Prohibition, I should say appealing Prohibition. Of course, that's the Great Depression. By opening up distilleries, many jobs were created once again. And as I said, in 1933, with the 21st Amendment, Prohibition was officially repealed on April 7th, 1933. Now, before we completely leave behind the noble experiment, as Prohibition was also called, it should be noted that going into Prohibition, bourbon was a very popular drink for a lot of people. And of course, during Prohibition, it really took a hit. After 1933, bourbon production and spirit production as a whole obviously started to ramp up again. And then the U.S. enters World War II, and production basically has to be shut down. This time not for the grains, but actually for alcohol. So what the U.S. needed was these distilleries to produce 190 proof industrial alcohol, which was going to be used in things like plastics and antifreeze, ammunition, all kinds of things that the Army, the armed forces needed for the United States. So to help out with the war effort, instead of making bourbon or other spirits, the distilleries started to make this 190 proof alcohol. So not officially another period of Prohibition, but you could say that this was a bit of a time of Prohibition at least for the distilleries who were finally getting back on their feet. So I probably went on a lot longer about all of that than I had intended to. But I would like to get to our next moment in big moments in bourbon history. And this is 1949. This big moment in history focuses on a man who was very important to the bourbon industry. And it takes us to the George T. Stagg Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. This distillery would later be known as Buffalo Trace Distillery. And the man we are focused on is Elmer T. Lee. So why is this such a big deal? Well, first, let's talk about Elmer T. Lee. He served in World War II in the U.S. Army Air Force. He was a radar bombardier on a B-29. Did a lot of missions in Japan, and eventually he came home because he was honorably discharged in January of 1946. And when he came home, he started studying engineering at the University of Kentucky, where he graduated with honors in 1949. So the story goes that when Elmer showed up for his interview, which was with Colonel Albert B. Blanton, we'll get back to that name in a bit, but he was the iconic president of the distillery at that time. He said to Elmer, "Son, we're not hiring any hands today." Well, Orville Shupp heard this. He was the manager of the distillery, and he ran out and he told Elmer, "Come back next week." Elmer did, and thankfully was hired by the distillery. And if it wasn't for the plant manager at the time telling him to come back, Elmer T. Lee may not have been able to introduce to the world something very special. And this actually occurred in 1984. So you could almost say that this is a bonus big moment in bourbon history. 1984, Elmer T. Lee introduces to the world single barrel bourbon. And of course, who does he name it after? The man who once was very skeptical of him, Colonel Blanton. So Blanton's Single Barrel. That is where the name comes from, and it is because of Elmer T. Lee that we have this amazing concept known as single barrel bourbon. And the reason I say it's amazing is if you really think about it, a barrel of bourbon, I believe, makes about 200 bottles of bourbon. So when those 200 bottles are made from that single barrel and they're sold out, we will truly never get that exact same taste ever again anywhere in the world. And it's because of Elmer T. Lee that we have this concept. And of course it stays with us today. In fact, Rabbit Hole Distillery down in Louisville, it's a very famous craft distillery down there. They just released their very first single barrel bourbon. So again, because of Elmer T. Lee being hired by Colonel Blanton in 1949, we have single barrel bourbon. And by the way, Elmer T. Lee officially retired in 1985, and he has a whole lot of accolades to his name, including being in the Bourbon Hall of Fame. And he did pass away at the age of 93 in 2013, just about a week shy of his 94th birthday. So, cheers to you, Mr. Elmer T. Lee. For our next big moment in bourbon history, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I talked about this in the first two episodes quite a bit, but this takes us to 1964, and this was the year that U.S. Congress officially recognized bourbon as a distinctive spirit of the United States. Now, I broke down in other episodes what's all in this bill, basically. But what I didn't talk about is that some of the impetus for this is that other countries did have distinctive products, specifically spirits in this case that we're talking about, and the U.S. wanted to have their own. For example, Scotch whiskey only comes from Scotland. Canadian whiskey only comes from Canada. Cognac can only come from France. So because bourbon did originate in the United States and was basically only made in the United States, the U.S. Congress wanted to make sure that bourbon had that distinction of being a product that is distinctive of the United States of America. And I couldn't agree more. Let's move on to our final big moment in bourbon history. This one is actually going to take us to TV land. The year is 2007, And a TV series that is going to become very popular and run until 2015 makes its debut, starring Joe Hamm, Elizabeth Moss, and a plethora of very talented and famous actors. Mad Men hits the airwaves. So big deal, what does this have to do with bourbon? Well, the show takes place in the 1960s. And Don Draper, the main character in the show, loves his bourbon drinks. In fact, in the very first episode, he says, "Give me another one of these, an old-fashioned." And of course, he's talking about a bourbon old-fashioned here. Then you see throughout the series a number of drinks being made with bourbon. Manhattans, mint juleps, and on and on and on. People love the show, and of course, Hollywood has a great influence on culture. So bourbon finds its way back into the national scene. Side note here, I'm from Wisconsin, as I think I've mentioned in the first episode. It was surprising to me to hear how many people had first learned of an old-fashioned, really, through Mad Men, because growing up in Wisconsin, everybody knew what an old-fashioned was. Now, granted, they're usually brandy old-fashions, but we knew that old-fashions had to do with being a cocktail, mixed drink, some bitters, sugar, fruit, which I realize that the traditional old-fashioned may not be made that way. But of course, in Wisconsin, even growing up as a kid, you pretty much knew what an old-fashioned was. But let's give credit where credit is due, and Mad Men has certainly played a big role in bringing bourbon back to be a very popular spirit. And my friends, that is not an opinion. That is a fact. Let's take a look at some statistics as we wrap up today's episode. Just production statistics in Kentucky alone. These are from the Kentucky's Distillers Association. Distilleries filled, just in Kentucky, over 2.1 million barrels of bourbon last year. And that's the highest production year ever, and the second straight year with 2 million barrels filled. The Kentucky Distillers Association started taking these stats in 1967. In 1967, they had not yet reached 2 million new barrels produced. They came close, but they weren't there. But then when you look 1974 all the way to 2011, the amount of bourbon barrels being filled with bourbon was under 1 million, all the way till 2011. It wasn't until 2012 that bourbon distillers in Kentucky broke that 1 million barrel mark for new production. But even look at this. So 2012 is just over 1 million. Now we're in 2021. We're over 2.1 million barrels of bourbon being produced in a year. So it's doubled in production in less than a decade. So hopefully this is an indicator that bourbon is here to stay, because all of these distilleries in the end are gambling that bourbon is going to remain as popular as it is now. I personally don't see it going anywhere. I know for me it's not going anywhere. And if we look at the beer industry with the craft breweries and how well they have all done, I think we see a lot of that in the bourbon industry. And the gamble that these distillers are taking, I think, is going to pay off very well. Well, those facts and thoughts bring us to the end of episode 3 of Unburden with Bourbon. Thanks again so much for listening, and thanks for your patience for waiting for this episode to come out. Now, before I sign off, I do want to make sure I cite my sources for you, as these are all wonderful places to go to learn more about bourbon. So all the websites I used for this episode are History, The Spirits Business, Buffalo Trace Distillery, Rabbit Hole Distillery, StayHappening.com, kybourbon.com, Bourbon Buzz, themobmuseum.org, and the website of Dueling Grounds Distillery. I also used a wonderful book that I highly recommend buying. No, I don't get paid to say that. It's just a book my wife bought me, and I thoroughly enjoyed and used some stats from that book for today's episode as well. It is called Barrel Strength Bourbon, The Explosive Growth of America's Whiskey by Carla Harris Carlton. Also, I do want to give a shout out to a podcast that I thoroughly enjoy. It's called Shadow Carriers. It deals with ghost stories, and they've got a whole season about ghost stories in Chicago. I do believe their next season they're recording right now, and that's going to take place in New Orleans. So, Shadow Carriers, check out that podcast. I have found it on Spotify. And full disclosure, my good friend Orion Cooling is one of the producers on Shadow Carriers. But he's a wonderful human being, and more importantly, although I may be biased, I listened to all 7 episodes of that while doing some gardening, and I found every single one of them absolutely entertaining. So, Shadow Carriers, check it out. Well, my friends, now this is officially the end of episode 3 of Unburden with Bourbon. Thank you again for joining me, and, well, we'll see when we get episode 4 out. You know, episode 3 took 2 months to finally get out there. Hopefully episode 4 comes out a lot sooner than that. But nevertheless, this does bring our series on big moments in bourbon history to an end. Now, I certainly enjoyed researching all of this history and sharing it with you, and I hope you got some enjoyment out of it. Whatever the case may be, I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of Unburden with Bourbon and for your support of this podcast. I enjoy doing it even if time is short, and knowing that there are at least a couple of people out there listening in means the world to me. So thank you. And remember, don't be a burden on others by drinking and driving. After all, you may become more than just a burden. Instead, find a place where you can safely enjoy this wonderful spirit, a place where you can unburden with bourbon.